In a world where fandoms collide, where epic stories shape our lives, and where passion for all things geeky connects us across time and space, welcome to the Geek Unified Theory. Hosted by the one and only Jeffrey Harlan, your guide through the worlds of heroes, villains, and everything in between. Grab your controller, pick up your favorite graphic novel, and settle in for the ride. It's time for the Geek Unified Theory. Hey geeks, welcome to Geek Unified Theory Episode 4. I'm your host, Jeffrey Harlan. In this episode, we'll explore the evolution of comic books, tracing their journey from their early origins to the powerhouse medium that they are today. This episode is brought to you by my novel, Invasion, Book 1 of the Protectorate. John just wanted to be a normal teenager, but he had superpowers. As Pyre, he's the leader of a team of young heroes. Supervillains and life-and-death decisions are part of his life now. Does he have what it takes to lead his team and save the world when aliens invade? Invasion is available on my site, jeffreyharlan.com, and worldwide at retailers like Amazon and Kobo. So today we're going to talk about the beginning of comics, the golden age, the silver age, the impact of major events, the rise of graphic novels, and modern comic culture. Now, I've started collecting comic books when I was young. I was very fascinated by the medium. I started off with Transformers comics, G.I. Joe comics, moved into superheroes with Superman, Spider-Man, X-Men, and that kind of sparked something in me because I started coming up with my own comic characters when I was in middle school. And I developed those stories, and that eventually became my own self-published comic book, The Protectorate. And The Protectorate went 4 issues, because I was writing it, I was drawing it, but I was also working full-time, and I was going back to school, getting my degree at Cal State Fullerton. So it took me a good 5 years to publish 4 issues. It was a lot of work, and it took me a lot longer than I thought it would. Eventually that became my novels. Those 4 issues plus the incomplete 5th issue were turned into my novel Invasion. And the backstory that I created for those comics became my novel Donner and Blitzkrieg, as well as its sequel, Crusaders. So with the birth of comics, starting off in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, we had comic strips, illustrated stories, and they were published in newspapers, like The Yellow Kid in 1895 and Little Nemo and Slumberland in 1905. One of these strips was eventually turned into a book format, and publishers began to realize, we can take these strips, publish collections of them, and sell those magazines and make money that way. Some of these early comic strips that got turned into books were like Buck Rogers, which just entered the public domain this year. And then Superman was originally intended to be a comic strip in the newspapers, but no one would pick it up until finally they turned it into a book and was picked up by National Publications, now known as DC, and it became Action Comics #1 in 1938. Printing technology at the time allowed comics to be distributed more widely. This paved the way for comics to become a major form of popular entertainment. The golden age of comics in the 1930s and 40s is also the rise of the superheroes. So we had Superman, 1938. A year later, Batman appeared in Detective Comics #27 in 1939. couple of years after that, you had Wonder Woman in 1941. You also had, in 1940, Captain America. You had Namor, the Submariner, and I believe that was also 1939. A lot of these characters started popping up. Superman became massive success, so everybody wanted to jump in on that bandwagon. So you got dozens and dozens of heroes appearing in these first few years, and a lot of them have since fallen into the public domain. Some of them are slowly starting to appear in the public domain as the rights expire on the copyrights. Superman will be entering the public domain in just a few years. I believe it's 2034. So, the creation of Superman led to this entire genre of superheroes. This was also influenced by the time that this was happening in, the end of the Great Depression and the beginnings of World War II. So this influenced creation of characters like Captain America. There are other characters very similar to him that also appeared at about this time. The Shield from MLJ Comics. You've also got Fighting American and lots of other patriotic themed heroes. Just dozens of them. Most of them have since fallen into the public domain. Superheroes weren't the only genre at the time, though. You also had other popular genres. You got crime comics, romance comics, horror comics. Kids weren't the only audience being targeted by these publishers because they wanted to try to make as much money as possible, of course. So they targeted other audiences, adult audiences with the horror comics, the romance comics, the crime comics. But the standout successes were, initially at least, the superheroes. And they really defined the golden age of comics. Now, the Silver Age, it's 1950s, 1960s. One of the things that happened at this time was the anti-comics movement led by Dr. Frederick Wortham, who published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. He believed that comic books were contributing to juvenile delinquency. He operated under the assumption that all comics must be for children, ignoring the fact that there are a lot of these people that had grown up on these comics that were now adults that were reading these other genres like crime comics. So he targeted crime comics, horror comics, and he also went completely in on superheroes as well. He was a student of the Freudian school of psychology, and he saw sex in everything. He was absolutely adamant that Batman and Robin were a homosexual couple, and he was very focused on this and just being an affront to everything, and he was convinced that Wonder Woman was a horrific lesbian character, and it just went on and on and on. His book sold massive amount of copies. It drove a frenzy of people to try to get comics banned, and there were book burnings of comic books, and it ultimately, this was at the same time as the Red Scare, ultimately led to action from a congressional hearing. And rather than let the government tell comic books what they could or could not do, they self-censored to try to prevent something even worse being implemented. And so they implemented what was known as the Comics Code Authority. And this was extremely restrictive. It was based on the Hays Code from the film industry. And it pretty much left everything except for superheroes, funny animals, romance comics were the only survivors. Anything else pretty much was not able to continue under these rules. One of the companies that had done extremely well up until this point was EC Comics with their horror comics and their crime comics. Tales from the Crypt was an EC comic book. And they were on the verge of going bankrupt, and they kept presenting new comic concepts that were absolutely within these guidelines, but they were being targeted. So they kept rejecting all of their comics so they wouldn't be able to get published. So they decided, hey, we're not going to deal with this anymore. We're going to publish our stuff as a magazine. And that magazine was Mad Magazine. So if it was not for this chain of events, we would not have had Mad Magazine. Superheroes also were affected by these rules. Originally, you had very dark, pulp-inspired superhero characters. Early Batman stuff was much darker than people would think for the era, because of how pervasive the 1950s and 60s versions of the characters became. Early Batman, in the very first issue of that he appeared in Detective Comics, he killed quite a few of the villains. Joker was killed in his first issue, and they had to draw in an extra little bit at the end because they realized he was going to be a popular character even before the issue went out. So they drew in an extra panel at the end saying, "Oh, wait, he's not actually dead." This happened a lot with that character. So in the 1950s and 60s, to adhere to the comics code, superhero comics transformed significantly. This is when you started getting things like Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane getting her own comic and having just bizarre romance themes, and she's constantly trying to expose that Clark Kent is Superman, but he keeps coming up with ways to basically the gaslighter. They introduce Superboy at this time, and so you have the adventures of Superman as a child. You have Supergirl, Crypto the Superdog, Streaky the Supercat, Comet the Superhorse, and it just gets more and more insane as time goes on, quite honestly. Towards the end of this, in the early 1960s, you started getting into new types of characters from Marvel. Marvel, at this time, featured Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and just some amazing talent from these creators. They helped shape the Marvel that we know today. Spider-Man, X-Men, Iron Man, Fantastic Four. They reinvigorated the industry. They brought these characters in and did something totally new that still fit within the guidelines of the comics code by introducing flawed heroes. DC started bringing back some of their older characters from the Golden Age. They created new sci-fi versions of the Flash and Green Lantern. They introduced a lot of new characters this time too. This is also about the time that the Justice League first appeared. Before this, we had the Justice Society in the 40s and 50s. And the Justice League was a little bit different. Justice Society became basically like a family of superheroes. Justice League was like, they were just a team of superheroes. Fantastic Four was a family of superheroes. The Avengers were a team of superheroes. There's a very fine distinction there. They also started introducing concepts like the multiverse in DC Comics at this point, because you had all these old Superman stories that didn't quite mesh with the new Superman stories. And so they decided that all that stuff from the old comics happened on a different Earth, and the stuff that's happening now is on, basically, we're going to call it Earth 1, and the old stuff was Earth 2. And they started having crossovers between Earth 1 and Earth 2. And that really was a new concept that they introduced there that wasn't quite as big as it is today. Today, you've got the multiverse everywhere. You've got it in Marvel movies, you got it on DC, everything. I mean, there was even, back in the 90s, there was even the TV show Sliders. The whole concept was the multiverse. So the 1970s saw the birth of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was the start of more modern storytelling. It was darker, more complex, pushing the limits of the comics code. They started doing a lot more mature themes and social concepts that were really in the public consciousness at the time. Drug abuse, social justice, Spider-Man, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, they really tackled these things. It was a big deal when DC did a Green Lantern, Green Arrow comic where they revealed that Speedy, Green Arrow's sidekick, was a heroin addict. And it was rejected by the comics code, and DC decided to publish it anyway. And they did. It was one of the first times that one of these companies really just rebelled against the comics code. And more publishers started to push against these restrictions. Eventually, the comic code did go away in the 90s. It's no longer really a concern at all. At this time, creators like Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil, Frank Miller, Steve Englehart, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, they were starting to introduce more adult themes, darker narratives, and some really innovative art styles that hadn't been seen in comics before at this point. The 70s also saw the introduction of the graphic novel. Will Eisner's A Contract with God in 1978 was one of the first of these, and it really elevated the medium into something more artistic and literary than it had been in the past. The 80s and 90s are known more as the dark age of comics. Everything was just dark and gritty and violent. You got stories like The Dark Knight Returns in 1986, Watchmen, also in 1986, Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons. This redefined DC, and it led to a lot more comics with this kind of storytelling. It was much darker. It took on the concepts of anti-heroes like Punisher, Venom, Wolverine. And we started getting more stories that were in that vein. Image Comics formed in the early 90s. Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and several other very popular creators left Marvel and DC to create their own independent company. Really brought an emphasis on artist-driven storytelling, higher levels of graphic violence in the comics, and also a very unique, detailed style, which was prevalent throughout the 90s. Another thing that they did was that these comic companies are publishing holographic covers, foil covers, and just really pushing the speculator bubble of the time. Rare issues were seen as an investment opportunity, but this just got more and more and more, and eventually it got to the point where everything was a special issue. Everything was restarting with a new number one every, like year and a half, 2 years. And ultimately that just led to a crash in the market. And a lot of these things that people thought at the time were going to be worth a lot of money are really not worth much more than the paper that they're printed on. I never really got into the whole speculator thing. I cared more about the stories that were in the comics. Everybody else was like polybagging their comics as soon as they bought them. And, even today, you still get people that are like getting their comics graded and they don't even want to touch them without gloves on so they don't get, any oils on them. I never cared about any of that. I wanted the stories. So if I didn't get the foil cover, I didn't care. I got the regular cover because I just wanted the story in it. The 2000s and 2010s marked the beginning of the modern era. The modern era really saw a reinvention of the medium, a rise of a lot of new voices. Films were starting to gain a lot more influence too, because you're having X-Men in 2000, Spider-Man in 2002. Comics are becoming more popular with the public at large, and elements from the movie adaptations are starting to influence the comics that were originally inspiring the movies, and back and forth. And you saw a lot of things like where if something new was introduced in a movie, eventually it would make its way into the comics. Like with Spider-Man having the organic web shooters in the 2000 movie, the 2002 movie rather, that eventually made its way into the comics as well. It wasn't very long, but there was a point where they did this storyline where, like, his body went into a cocoon and he came out and he had organic web shooters. Eventually that went away. Graphic novels also really started to become more popular. There was a boom of those in the 2000s. Persepolis in 2000, Mouse in 1992 was just a phenomenal comic. It won many awards, and rightly so. And these helped also to elevate comics once more to a more literary and respected form of storytelling. Indie comics were on the rise at this time. We started seeing that in the 90s with like Dark Horse and Image, and other publishers like Viz Media also started really gaining a lot more of the market. DC and Marvel to this day still dominate the market, but these independent publishers also have a much more of a presence than they did in the past. There are a lot of reboots at this point in time too. Marvel did the Ultimate Comics in the 2000s that really inspired a lot of other reboots, similar reboots. DC has had reboot after reboot after reboot. I mean, it started with Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1986, but then you've also had little mini Crisis follow-ups to that. You had 0 Hour Crisis in Time in the 90s, and then you had the New 52 in 2011, Rebirth, and many others. It's gotten to the point where it's getting kind of hard to follow. They reboot so often. We're also now in what's a digital age of comics. You got digital comics, you got web comics. Comixology was just a huge part of that rise of digital comics. Eventually it was bought out by Amazon, and Comixology itself as a platform no longer exists. Now all of the Comixology comics are being integrated into the Kindle platform. But that also was a huge thing in the early 2000s, 2010s. Webtoon also had a lot of web comics. Web comics are a very big thing. They're still a big thing. You can find a lot of webcomics on, for example, on Instagram. Crowdfunding has become another big thing. Crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter have enabled a lot of indie books to get published that otherwise wouldn't, because it's expensive to make comic books and to distribute them and to get them out there. And a lot of these creators are turning to platforms like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and getting the platform to get their comics out there, get them noticed, and get the funding to make them. Comics have started to embrace a lot more new technologies now. Like we've got virtual reality, augmented reality, interactive comics. There's a lot of things that we can do with the new digital technologies that just were not possible even just a couple of decades ago. The future of comics is still pretty good. There's still a lot of comics being published, but we're seeing a lot more in the digital space now than we had in the past. Comic shops still exist, but there's not quite as many of them. Bookstores are all but gone. So now we're seeing a lot more of a transition to a digital medium. We're also seeing a lot more independent creators bringing a lot more diverse ideas that otherwise might not have seen the light of day in the past. We're seeing new forms of storytelling from these writers that are all bringing something new to the table. We've seen comics go from very simple strips in the newspapers, and over the course of just a century have transformed into a massive industry. And as a fan, comics inspired me to become the creator that I am today. As a creator, I've gotten the opportunity to meet a lot of fascinating people through events like Comic-Con. I've met other comic creators. I've met some online in digital spaces. And it's just been an incredible journey over the last couple of decades that I've been doing this. I would love to hear any of your stories. What are some of the classic comics that you've enjoyed? What are some of the graphic novels that have resonated with you? What's your favorite character? What's your favorite storyline? Please let me know. I would love to hear that. This week in Geek. For the week of January 20th through the 26th of 2025. January 20th is the birthday of Buzz Aldrin in 1930. It's one of the first men on the moon. Rainn Wilson in 1966. He's been in many genre films, including a couple of superhero films. Fans of Star Trek might also know that he played Harry Mudd in Star Trek Discovery, as well as being on The Office, of course. Also on the 20th, in 1987, Evan Peters was born, perhaps best known to comic fans as Quicksilver in the X-Men films. January 22nd is National Library Shelfie Day. Go ahead and head off to the library and take a selfie in front of some of the book stacks. January 23rd, Star Trek Picard premiered in 2020. On January 24th, it's the International Day of Education. It's also Macintosh Computer Day. January 25th is Winter Inmas, which lasts from the 25th through the 31st. And January 26th is Dungeons and Dragons Day. for the week of January 27th through February 2nd of 2025. January 27th is Patton Oswalt's birthday. He was born in 1969. January 28th, Elijah Wood was born in 1981. The 28th is also Data Privacy Day in the US. It's also known as Data Protection Day in Europe. The 28th is also International Lego Day. January 30th, Gene Hackman was born in 1930. Perhaps best known to comic fans as Lex Luthor in the 1970s and 80s Superman films. And Christian Bale, perhaps best known as Batman in the Dark Knight trilogy, was born in 1974. January 30th is also National Draw a Dinosaur Day. January 31st, Star Wars A New Hope Special Edition premiered in 1997. February is Free Open Source Software Month. It's also Harley Quinn Month, National Library Lovers Month, and National Women Inventors Month. February 1st was the birthday of Brandon Lee, who was born in 1965. Perhaps best known for his role as Eric Draven in The Crow, which he tragically died while filming. February 2nd is 2FA Day, or Two-Factor Authentication Day. February 2nd is also Groundhog Day. So thanks for listening. Join us next time when we discuss how online communities have shaped the modern geek scene. Be sure to like and subscribe, and visit us at our website, geekunifiedtheory.com, and on social media, facebook.com/geekunifiedtheory, Instagram @geekunifiedtheory, and Blue Sky @geekunifiedtheory.com. Recorded and mastered by Jeffrey Harlan. Music by Ovani Sound and Hyperreal Records. Used under license. Geek Unified Theory is a production of Confluent Press Audio. Copyright 2025, Jeffrey Harlan, DBA Confluent Press. All rights reserved.